My grandmother lay intubated in the intensive care unit when my own mother and uncle auctioned off her entire jewelry collection. They valued it at $220,000 and told the extended family she had already approved it to cover her medical bills. I sat beside her hospital bed every day and said nothing to them. I just documented their lies. On the day she was finally discharged, she asked to see her lawyer. What my grandmother pulled from her hospital robe pocket that afternoon made my mother grip the dining room doorframe just to stay standing. My name is Aurelia Phelan, and I am 32 years old. I read vital signs for a living. Welcome to Fluffy Revenge, the channel where quiet women win the loudest battles by letting the opposition dig their own graves. Tell me in the comments, how old are you and where are you listening from today? I read every single one, so be sure to subscribe. As a physician assistant, I spend my days interpreting the silent languages of the human body. The rhythm of a heart monitor, the oxygen saturation on a digital display, the sudden shift in a patient's skin tone. You learn quickly in this profession that panic helps no one. When a crisis hits you, lock your knees, you check the chart, and you document the facts. I never expected to apply that clinical detachment to my own family. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the waiting room at Mercy Hospital. The air smelled of industrial bleach and stale coffee. On the other side of the glass partition, my grandmother Vivian lay in a medically induced coma. A stroke had felled her 3 days prior, right in the middle of her morning routine. At 82, she was a woman who still balanced her own ledgers and drove a pristine sedan. She was a fixture in our Iowa community, a place where reputation is currency and family loyalty is treated as gospel. Now a machine breathed for her. My mother Brenda sat across from me in a vinyl waiting room chair. She had stepped out to take a phone call about her church committee, leaving her tablet unlocked on the side table. I reached over to slide it away from a sweating cup of ice water. The screen woke up. It was not a church email. It was a digital catalog for a high-end estate auction house based out of Chicago. I tapped the screen, assuming she was looking for a distraction. The page loaded a gallery of upcoming lots. Lot 412 was a vintage sapphire and diamond pendant. Lot 413 was an articulated gold bracelet. Lot 414 was a pair of emerald drop earrings. My breath caught, though I made no sound. I knew that sapphire. I knew the gold bracelet. I had watched Vivian secure them in the velvet-lined floor, safe in her bedroom, since I was 10 years old. They were the tangible legacy of the hardware supply business she had built from the ground up 40 years ago after her husband died, and left her with a mountain of debt. I scrolled further. Page after page of her rings, her brooches, her antique timepieces. The estimated hammer price for the collection sat right at $220,000. At the top of the screen, a banner read, "Liquidation in progress. Auction dates finalized." I did not confront my mother when she walked back into the room, her sensible flats clicking against the linoleum. I looked at her carefully ironed blouse and the polite, concerned smile she wore for the passing nurses. I set the tablet back down exactly as I had found it. We live in Iowa. People outside the Midwest often misunderstand the concept of Iowa nice. They mistake it for genuine, uncomplicated kindness. It is not. Iowa nice is a complex social contract, a rigid architecture of manners designed to prioritize community integrity and reputation above all else. In this traditional environment, you do not raise your voice. You do not air your grievances in public. You guard your family legacy with a polite, impenetrable smile. My mother Brenda was a master architect of this facade. She ran local church outreach committees with a clipboard and an iron grip. From the outside, she was the pillar of civic duty. Up close, her charity was highly transactional. She kept a mental ledger of who owed her favors and whose children had stumbled. She wore pastel cardigans and spoke in hushed, sympathetic tones, using pity to control the narrative around her. When a crisis hit, Brenda did not see a tragedy. She saw a stage. Then there was my Uncle David, Brenda's younger brother. David managed a mid-sized auto dealership on the edge of town. He wore tailored suits and drove a different luxury vehicle home every month, a perk of the lot that he eagerly passed off as personal wealth. But David was hollow. Behind the polished veneer, he was drowning. Over the years, I had caught the subtle markers of his financial distress. The credit cards declined at family dinners, the urgent phone calls he took while pacing in our driveway, the subtle ways he always needed a temporary loan from Vivian to cover a cash flow hiccup. Just weeks before the stroke, David had approached Vivian for another bridge loan. I had been at the house checking Vivian blood pressure when he cornered her in the kitchen. He claimed the dealership was restructuring and his commission checks were delayed. Vivian had stared at him over her reading glasses. She wrote him a check, but as she handed it over, she told him it was the final advance. The well was dry. David's jaw had tightened. He was a man sprinting to stay ahead of a collapsing credit score, and his mother had just cut his safety line. As for me, I existed on the periphery of their theater. I earned $130,000 a year at my clinic, a salary that granted me something my mother and uncle deeply resented: autonomy. I did not need to ask for loans. I did not need to rely on the family social standing. My profession required me to traffic in objective realities like blood panels and imaging reports. I had no patience for the unwritten rules of Iowa Nice. When Vivian grew older, a silent division of labor formed. I became the designated handler of the physical realities of aging. I managed her medication schedules and interpreted her doctor instructions. Brenda claimed the administrative duties. She managed Vivian mail and acted as the gatekeeper for social visits. It gave her proximity to the assets while I dealt with the symptoms. The chaos of those first 48 hours in the ICU provided the perfect cover for their operation. Vivian, the formidable matriarch who had controlled every dime of her own money, was suddenly incapacitated. I watched Brenda in the hospital corridors. She transformed instantly into the grieving, devoted daughter. The waiting room quickly filled with floral arrangements and foil-covered dishes. Brenda updated the church prayer chains, weeping softly into her phone, accepting the community sympathy like currency. David paced the waiting room, projecting the image of a stressed protector. He talked loudly to anyone who would listen about coordinating with insurance adjusters and managing his mother affairs so she would not have to worry. They built the smokescreen right in front of me. They spoke of tough choices and preparing for the worst. They suggested to the extended family that Vivian might need years of expensive round-the-clock memory care. It sounded reasonable to the relatives dropping off casseroles. But as a medical professional, I knew Vivian Chart. I knew she held a premium ironclad supplemental insurance policy that covered long-term rehabilitative care. There was no impending financial crisis. There was no medical debt threatening her estate. The panic Brenda and David were broadcasting was a manufactured crisis. It was the necessary preamble to their theft. I stood up from the waiting room chair and walked back into Vivian's room. The ventilator hissed in its steady mechanical rhythm. I picked up her hand. Her skin was cool, but beneath it her pulse beat strong. Steady. She was fighting. In that quiet room holding my grandmother's hand, I made a diagnostic decision. I would treat this betrayal exactly like a critical trauma. I would gather the data, and I would not make a single move until I was ready to close the incision. The rhythmic hum of the ventilator served as the only metronome in the intensive care unit. I stood at the foot of the bed reading the digital readouts on the monitor. Blood pressure stabilizing. Oxygen saturation holding steady at 98%. Intracranial pressure within acceptable limits. In medicine, before you can accurately diagnose a pathology, you must establish a baseline. You need to know what a patient looks like on a normal day to recognize when a physiological system begins to fail. To understand the anatomy of my family and their deception, I had to view them through that same diagnostic lens. The baseline of our environment was defined by the unwritten rules of our Midwestern town. People outside this region often mistake our local culture for genuine, uncomplicated kindness. It is a suffocating social contract. It is a rigid architecture of manners designed to prioritize community integrity and reputation above all else. You do not raise your voice. You do not air your grievances in public. You deliver hot casseroles to grieving widows, you attend the Friday night football games, and you guard your family legacy with a polite, impenetrable smile. This culture punishes deceit only if the deceit is messy enough to spill into the street. If you keep your fraud hidden behind closed doors and maintain the facade, the community will gladly look the other way. My mother, Brenda, was a master architect of this facade. Through the glass partition of the ICU room, I watched her orchestrate her performance in the hallway. Pastor Thomas had arrived. Brenda lowered her head, pressing a tissue to her cheek, presenting the exact image of a devastated, devoted daughter. She ran the local church outreach committees with a clipboard and an iron grip. From the outside, she was the pillar of civic duty. Up close, her charity was highly transactional. She kept a mental ledger of who owed her favors, who had donated less than their fair share, and whose children had stumbled. When a crisis hit, Brenda did not see a tragedy. She saw a stage. Beside her in the hallway stood my Uncle David. He managed a mid-sized auto dealership on the edge of town. He wore tailored suits and drove a different luxury vehicle home every month, a perk of the lot that he eagerly passed off as personal wealth. But watching him pace the linoleum floor, checking his phone every 30 seconds, I saw the truth. David was a hollow man standing on quicksand. Over the years, I had caught the subtle markers of his financial distress. The credit cards declined at family dinners, the urgent phone calls he took while pacing in our driveway, the nervous sweat that broke out on his neck when the topic of investments arose. Just weeks before the stroke, I witnessed the event that broke him. I had been at Vivian House checking her blood pressure. David cornered her in the kitchen. He claimed the dealership was restructuring and his commission checks were delayed. He needed a bridge loan. Vivian stared at him over her reading glasses, her expression unreadable. She wrote him a check, but as she handed it over, she told him it was the final advance. The well was dry. David's jaw tightened. His knuckles turned white as he snatched the paper. He was a man sprinting to stay ahead of a collapsing credit score, and his mother had just cut his safety line. As for me, I existed on the periphery of their theater. At 32, I worked as a physician assistant at a regional orthopedic clinic. I earned a salary that granted me something my mother and uncle deeply resented: autonomy. I did not need to ask for loans. I did not need to rely on the family social standing for my own success. My profession required me to traffic in objective realities like blood panels and imaging reports. I had no patience for the intricate unwritten rules of our town. When Vivian grew older, a silent division of labor formed. I became the designated handler of the physical realities of aging. I managed her medication schedules, interpreted her doctor instructions, and checked her vitals. Brenda claimed the administrative duties. She managed Vivian mail, organized her checkbook, and acted as the gatekeeper for social visits. It was a convenient arrangement. It gave Brenda proximity to the assets while I dealt with the symptoms, and those assets were substantial. Vivian was not a frail elder waiting for the end. She was 82 years old and possessed a mind like a steel trap. 40 years ago, when her husband passed away and left her drowning in debt, Vivian did not fold. She opened a small hardware supply business. She learned inventory supply chains and bulk contracting. She woke up at 4 a.m. for 3 decades, expanding that small storefront into a lucrative regional distributor. Vivian did not trust the stock market. She put her profits into something she could hold. She purchased high-end jewelry to mark her own victories. After a record-breaking fiscal quarter, she bought a 3-carat diamond tennis bracelet. When she paid off her original commercial mortgage, she acquired a vintage sapphire pendant. The collection, secured in a heavy floor safe, bolted to the foundation of her bedroom closet, represented survival. Those velvet boxes were the physical manifestation of a woman who had pulled herself out of ruin with her own bare hands. The sound of the ICU door sliding open pulled me back to the present. Dr. Evans, the attending neurointensivist, stepped into the room. Brenda and David followed close behind him, their faces arranged in masks of deep concern. The chaotic first 48 hours of the stroke provided the perfect cover for their operation. Vivian was suddenly incapacitated, unable to speak, and drifting in and out of consciousness. The sudden vacuum of authority left Brenda and David scrambling to seize control. Dr. Brenda began, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "We need to be realistic about my mother's future. With a stroke this severe, we are looking at permanent cognitive decline, aren't we? She will never be able to live independently again." It was a leading question. Brenda was not asking for a prognosis. She was shopping for a narrative. Dr. Evans glanced at his tablet. "It is too early to make definitive statements about permanent deficits. We need to wait for the swelling to decrease." David stepped forward, crowding the doctor's space. "But she is going to need round-the-clock memory care, right? We have to prepare for the worst. The financial burden of a long-term care facility is staggering. We need to start making tough choices now to protect her estate from being drained by medical bills." I stepped away from the monitor and placed myself between David and the doctor. I used my clinical voice, the one that carries authority without raising the volume. "Her intracranial pressure is stable," I said, looking directly at David. "The concept of neuroplasticity applies here. Many stroke patients recover significant function after the acute phase. Suggesting permanent memory care on day 3 is premature and medically unfounded." Dr. Evans nodded in agreement. "Your daughter is correct. Let us focus on weaning her off the ventilator first." The doctor excused himself, leaving the 3 of us in the room. Brenda offered me a tight, polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "You are just exhausted, Aurelia," she murmured, reaching out to pat my arm. "You are so close to the situation, you are not thinking clearly. David and I are just trying to be practical. The costs are going to be astronomical. We have to liquidate assets before the hospital takes everything." I looked at my mother, hand on my arm, then at her face. I knew Vivian medical chart by heart. I knew she held a premium ironclad supplemental insurance policy that covered long-term rehabilitative care in full. There was no impending financial crisis. There was no mountain of medical debt threatening her estate. The financial panic Brenda and David were broadcasting to the doctors and the extended family was a manufactured crisis. It was the necessary smokescreen for their theft. They needed the community to believe that whatever financial moves they made in the coming weeks were acts of desperate, loving sacrifice. They were laying the groundwork to raid the floor safe. I stepped back, forcing Brenda's hand to drop from my arm. "I am going to run to her house," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "I need to grab her favorite lotion and a few personal items for when she wakes up." David shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward Brenda. "We already went by the house," he said quickly. "We grabbed everything she needs." "I will just be a minute," I replied, grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. As I walked out of the ICU, the clinical detachment settled over me like a heavy lead apron. The baseline had fractured. The pathology was taking root. I needed to see exactly how far the infection had spread, and the only way to do that was to look inside that bedroom closet. The drive from Mercy Hospital to Vivian property took exactly 14 minutes. I drove with the radio off, letting the rhythmic hum of the engine ground my racing thoughts. Back in the intensive care unit, Vivian was entering a stable yet perilous phase of her recovery. The acute crisis of the stroke had passed, leaving her in that delicate middle ground where the body fights to repair damaged neurological pathways. She was stabilized, breathing in tandem with the mechanical ventilator, but she remained entirely voiceless. Her inability to speak was the exact vulnerability my mother and uncle were counting on. They needed a silent patient so they could dictate their own version of her medical history. I parked my vehicle in the driveway of the colonial-style home Vivian had meticulously maintained for 4 decades. The lawn was cut with mathematical precision, the hedges shaped into flawless rectangles. Vivian commanded order in every aspect of her life. She was a woman who built a regional hardware distribution empire in an era when women were expected to stay in the kitchen. She earned every brick of this house. Stepping through the front door, the silence inside felt heavy and unnatural. The air usually carried the scent of lemon polish and fresh linen. Today, a faint lingering trace of generic floral perfume hung in the foyer. It was Brenda's signature scent. My mother had already breached the perimeter. My clinical training dictates that you must look for the source of internal bleeding before addressing superficial wounds. I bypassed the kitchen and walked straight down the hallway toward the master suite. Along the way, minor disruptions caught my eye. A stack of mail on the credenza sat shuffled out of date order. An antique writing desk drawer remained a fraction of an inch ajar. These were tiny diagnostic markers of an intrusion. Vivian never left a drawer partially open. The master bedroom appeared immaculate at first glance, the bed made with crisp hospital corners. However, the heavy oak door to her walk-in closet stood wide open. I stepped inside, brushing past the row of woolen winter coats that smelled faintly of cedar. At the back of the closet beneath a false floorboard, Vivian had installed 20 years ago, sat her heavy steel floor safe. The Persian rug that normally concealed the board was tossed carelessly aside. The thick steel lid, which required a complex combination and a physical key to bypass, was thrown back on its hinges. I knelt on the hardwood floor and stared into the dark square cavity. The interior was hollow. The velvet display boxes that housed the vintage sapphire pendant, the articulated gold bracelet, the emerald drop earrings, every single piece of her $220,000 legacy was gone. They had not merely taken shiny trinkets, they had stolen her safety net. They extracted the physical proof of her survival and resilience. The sheer efficiency of the theft revealed this was not a spontaneous crime of opportunity. This was a calculated operation. Brenda and David had likely secured the safe combination weeks ago, perhaps during one of those polite afternoon visits where Brenda pretended to organize Vivian paperwork for tax season. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my mother number. I did not feel blind rage. Rage is a sloppy, unpredictable emotion. It clouds judgment and causes hands to shake during delicate procedures. I felt a cold, hyper-focused clarity. I was a practitioner identifying a malignant symptom in real time. The line clicked open on the second ring. Brenda answered with a hushed, breathless tone hitting the exact frequency of a woman burdened by tragic responsibilities. "Hello, Aurelia," she whispered, pitching her voice as if she were standing in a church sanctuary instead of the hospital cafeteria. "Are you back at the clinic already?" "I am standing in Vivian closet," I said, keeping my vocal register flat and even. "The floor safe is empty." "Where are the velvet boxes, Brenda?" A tactical hesitation stretched across the line. My mother was calculating her pivot. Then she deployed the first maneuver of her smear campaign, wrapping herself in a cloak of wounded martyrdom. "Oh, sweetheart." Her voice trembled, oozing with manufactured pity. "I know this situation is so much for you to process right now. You are working such long shifts at the clinic, and the stress is clearly making you paranoid. David and I took care of those items. We moved them to a secure location for safekeeping. A secure location, I repeated, stripping all emotion from my words. You emptied her safe while she is on life support. It is what she wanted." Brenda insisted, her tone hardening just a fraction beneath the saccharine sweetness. "She approved this months ago, Aurelia. We had a long, difficult talk about her future. With the staggering cost of the memory care facility she is going to need, we have to be practical. We are just liquidating some unnecessary assets to protect her estate. We are doing this for her. It is a terrible burden for David and me to bear, but we are making the tough choices so you do not have to worry your pretty head about it." I listened to the lie construct itself piece by piece. As a healthcare provider, I spot fabricated symptoms every single day. Patients lie about their diet, their pain scales, their substance habits. You learn to cross-reference their stories against the objective lab results. Brenda narrative failed every clinical metric. Vivian held a gold standard supplemental insurance policy. It covered long-term care in home nursing and rehabilitation without a single out-of-pocket deductible. There was zero financial threat to the estate. Vivian had proudly showed me the policy documents last Thanksgiving, detailing how she engineered her finances so she would never be a burden to anyone. Vivian Insurance covers everything I stated, presenting the objective fact like a test result. There are no impending medical bills. You and David have zero legal authority to liquidate her property. Brenda let out a sharp, condescending sigh. You do not understand high-level finances, Aurelia. You just draw blood and fetch medical charts. Let the adults handle the business end of this tragedy. We are her children. We know what is best for our mother. Do not cause a scene and embarrass this family while we are grieving. She ended the call. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a flat, monotonous note signaling the end of the negotiation. I lowered the phone and let the quiet of the empty house press in around me. Brenda had just confirmed her entire strategy. She intended to use the guise of Iowa niece, the polite veneer of familial duty, to mask a felony. She would paint me to the community as the hysterical, overworked daughter, preemptively discrediting any alarm I tried to raise. She knew that in our town, accusing a devoted church-going mother of theft would be seen as a grave breach of decorum. Embarrassing the family was the ultimate sin, and she wielded that cultural rule like a shield. I stared down into the empty steel void in the floor. My family was not planning for a tragic outcome. They were actively robbing a woman who was currently fighting for her next breath in an intensive care unit. They thought they had neutralized the threat because Vivian could not speak, and they assumed I was too polite to cause a public scandal. They mistook my professional calm for submission. In medicine, when a pathogen mutates to evade the immune system, you do not surrender. You change the treatment protocol. You observe the spread, you track the markers, and you wait for the precise moment to administer the cure. I reached down and closed the heavy steel lid of the safe, listening to the metallic clack as it locked into place. I stood up, dusted off my knees, and prepared to chart every single lie they were about to tell. I left the colonial house exactly as I found it. No slammed doors broke the silence. No outward signs of my discovery remained in the master bedroom. In the medical field, when a provider encounters a systemic infection, emotional outbursts waste precious time. You initiate a paper trail. You chart the symptoms. You build an irrefutable record of the disease progression. I drove back to my apartment, opened my laptop, and began treating my relatives like a complex diagnostic puzzle. My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The extended family group text, created mere hours after Vivian suffered her stroke, lit up with a new message from Brenda. I unlocked the screen and read the transmission. David and I are making some very tough financial choices today to ensure Mom receives the best memory care possible and to save her house, the text read. Please pray for our strength during this heartbreaking transition. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. By framing the theft as a painful sacrifice, Brenda cast herself and David as the tragic heroes of our family narrative. I watched the replies roll in on the screen. Distant cousins sent sympathetic emojis. Family friends typed long paragraphs praising Brenda for her tireless devotion. No one questioned the logistics. No one asked why an 82-year-old woman with a regional hardware empire and a premium insurance policy suddenly needed saving. The local culture demanded blind trust and polite declarations of hardship. I took screenshots of every single message. I captured the timestamps, the supportive replies, the digital applause for their fraudulent martyrdom. Then I returned to the browser history I had observed on Brenda tablet in the waiting room. I located the Chicago auction house website. Navigating to the upcoming estate sales, I searched the catalog for Vivian distinctive pieces. There they were, professionally photographed against black velvet backgrounds, assigned lot numbers, and estimated starting bids. I scrolled through the visual evidence of a lifetime of hard work being parceled out to the highest bidder. The vintage sapphire pendant which Vivian had purchased to celebrate her first $1 million in revenue was listed as a pristine estate find. The articulated gold bracelet, a gift she bought herself after surviving a bout with breast cancer a decade ago, gleamed under the studio lighting. The emerald earrings sat perfectly positioned next to a silver scale. I downloaded the entire manifest. I saved the high-resolution images, the auction descriptions, and the projected hammer prices to an encrypted folder on my hard drive. I backed the files up to a secure cloud server. I was creating a pristine digital chart securing the evidence before the pathogens could erase their tracks. The next morning at the hospital, a new layer of their strategy emerged. Brenda was deploying a preemptive strike against me. In epidemiology, a virus survives by actively mutating to evade the body's natural antibodies. Brenda was mutating her social narrative to neutralize my credibility before I could even formulate an accusation. I walked past the hospital cafeteria on my way to the intensive care unit and spotted my mother sitting at a corner table. She was flanked by two prominent women from her congregation. I stepped behind a structural column hidden from their line of sight and listened to the architecture of a smear campaign taking shape. The smell of burnt toast and sanitizing wipes hung heavy in the corridor while I stood perfectly still. Brenda leaned across the table, her voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. "I am just so worried about Aurelia," she murmured, stirring a packet of sugar into her decaf coffee with slow, deliberate circles. "She is working such demanding shifts at the orthopedic clinic. The stress of her job combined with the shock of mom condition is really taking a toll on her nerves." One of the women clicked her tongue in sympathy, adjusting her floral scarf. "It is so hard on the young ones," she whispered. "She is simply not thinking clearly." Brenda continued, letting out a measured theatrical sigh. She even imagined things going missing from the house yesterday. She was so frantic on the phone. "David and I are trying to shield her from the harsh realities of the estate management right now. We just want her to rest and focus on her career." The two women nodded, their faces arranged in matching expressions of deep, weaponized pity. It was a brilliant toxic maneuver. By painting me as a fragile, overworked daughter cracking under the emotional weight of a medical crisis, Brenda inoculated her social circle against any truth I might speak. If I stood up and declared my mother and uncle were thieves, the community would simply shake their heads. They would whisper about my mental breakdown and offer to pray for my sanity. Brenda was building a fortress out of our town cultural polite silence. I did not step out from behind the column. I did not interrupt her performance. Defending myself in the middle of a cafeteria would only play into the hysterical narrative she was currently spinning. Instead, I waited 5 minutes. I composed my features into a mask of quiet exhaustion, letting my shoulders slump just a fraction to sell the illusion, and walked into the intensive care unit. Brenda arrived 20 minutes later. She stood next to Vivian's bed, dabbing her dry eyes with a folded tissue, watching the steady rise and fall of the ventilator. I stood beside her, mirroring her solemn posture. When she placed a comforting hand on my shoulder and told me I needed to get more sleep, I nodded. I agreed with her. I played the exact part she had cast for me. The stressed, compliant, silent daughter who posed zero threat to the ongoing operation. David entered the room an hour later. He wore a sharp navy suit, looking less like a worried son and more like a man expecting an imminent windfall. He tossed his suit jacket over the back of a plastic visitor chair and approached the bed. He complained about the hospital parking fees, a trivial grievance meant to mimic normal family banter. My eyes stayed fixed on the jacket draped across the chair, noting the slight bulge in the inner breast pocket. A respiratory therapist entered the room to adjust Vivian ventilator tubing and check her airway clearance. He requested that the family step into the hall for a brief moment to allow him space to work around the delicate machinery. Brenda and David complied instantly, stepping outside to corner the therapist for another round of performative questioning regarding recovery timelines. I lingered behind, pretending to gather my discarded coffee cup from the windowsill. The moment the heavy glass door slid shut, separating me from my relatives in the hallway, I moved silently toward the visitor chair. I slipped my hand into the inner breast pocket of David's tailored jacket. My fingers brushed against smooth, thick cardstock. I extracted a crisp business card. The embossed gold logo belonged to the Chicago auction house. The name printed across the center read, Lawrence Gable Senior Estate Appraiser, complete with a direct cell phone number and an email address. David had not just called a general hotline. He was coordinating directly with a senior appraiser, which meant the contracts for the sale had likely already been signed. They were accelerating their timeline, pushing to convert the physical assets into untraceable cash before Vivian could regain consciousness and audit her own safe. I memorized the name, slipped the card into my scrub pocket, and stepped away from the chair just as the ICU doors hummed open again. I turned around, my face a perfect canvas of professional detachment, ready to chart the next symptom in this terminal breach of trust. 72 hours after the ischemic event, Vivian's neurological pathways began to fire with renewed purpose. The swelling in her brain receded, crossing a critical threshold that allowed her respiratory drive to take over. I stood in the corner of the intensive care unit watching the resident and the respiratory therapist prepare for the extubation. In medicine, removing a breathing tube is a delicate procedure. The patient must demonstrate they can pull enough tidal volume on their own. You observe their reflexes, you monitor the blood gases, and you wait for the precise moment when the body remembers how to sustain itself. Vivian's gag reflex returned early that morning. She was fighting the plastic tubing, her eyes fluttering open beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The respiratory therapist deflated the cuff, instructed her to cough, and pulled the endotracheal tube free in one swift motion. Vivian choked, drawing in her first unassisted breath of raw, sterile hospital air. Her face was pale, her silver hair matted against the thin pillow, but her eyes darted around the room with striking clarity. She was awake. The cognitive engine was running. Brenda and David were conspicuously absent. My mother was hosting a previously scheduled luncheon for the parish outreach committee, telling everyone she needed to maintain a sense of normalcy for her own mental health. My uncle was pacing the showroom floor of his auto dealership, likely dodging calls from debt collectors operating under the assumption that his mother would remain trapped in a coma for weeks. Their arrogant timing handed me a crucial tactical window. The resident checked Vivian's pupillary response, smiled, and declared the extubation a success. He advised her not to force her vocal cords immediately, noting her throat would feel like sandpaper for a few days. The medical team documented the chart and filed out of the room, leaving the door heavy and closed behind them. I stepped toward the bed. My grandmother looked at me, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Most families would break down crying at this milestone. They would lean over the bed rails, offering hollow reassurances and smothering the patient with useless platitudes. I did none of those things. I knew Vivian better than that. When I was 12 years old, I fell off a bicycle and fractured my radius. While Brenda hovered and wept over the sight of the cast, Vivian sat me down at her kitchen table, handed me a ledger from her hardware business, and taught me how to reconcile accounts payable. She told me that tears do not fix broken bones, and they certainly do not pay the bills. She trained me to value hard data over emotional theatrics. She respected truth no matter how sharp the edges were. I pulled a chair close to the bed railing. I did not hold her hand. I pulled my phone from my scrub pocket and opened the encrypted folder containing the downloaded auction manifest. I leaned forward, ensuring our voices would not carry into the corridor. "You suffered a severe stroke 3 days ago," I said, keeping my vocal register flat and clinical. "Your physical prognosis is promising, but we have a critical situation regarding your estate. Brenda and David cracked the floor safe in your bedroom." Vivian's gaze snapped to my face. The pulse oximeter clipped to her index finger registered a minor jump, but she remained silent, urging me to continue with a subtle tilt of her chin. "They emptied the velvet boxes," I stated. "They contacted Lawrence Gable, a senior estate appraiser at a Chicago auction house. Your entire jewelry collection is currently cataloged online and slated for public sale. The vintage sapphire pendant, the gold articulated bracelet, the emerald drops. Everything. They have valued the collection at $220,000. I turned the phone screen toward her, swiping through the high-resolution images of her stolen legacy. I let her see the lot numbers and the projected hammer prices. "Brenda is telling the extended family and her church circles that you approved this liquidation months ago." I continued delivering the facts like a pathology report. "She claims the money is necessary to save your house and cover the exorbitant costs of long-term memory care. They are spinning a narrative of financial ruin to justify the theft, and they are moving fast. They expect the auction to conclude before you leave this hospital." I waited for the physiological reaction. I expected a spike in her systolic blood pressure. I anticipated the monitor to alarm with sudden tachycardia. A normal person would weep. A normal person would display profound grief over being robbed by their own children while lying on life support. Vivian was not a normal person. She stared at the illuminated screen of my phone, examining the professional photographs of the diamonds and sapphires she had purchased with the profits of her own grueling labor. Then she turned her head and looked up at the acoustic tiles of the ceiling. The rhythmic beeping of her heart monitor did not accelerate. It slowed down. Her heart rate settled into the cold, calculated bradycardia of an apex predator analyzing a threat. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop. All the color drained from her expression, leaving behind a mask of terrifying crystalline focus. She absorbed the betrayal, processed the sheer audacity of her children's greed, and cataloged it. She closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, the raw vulnerability of a stroke victim had vanished entirely. "Water," she rasped. I poured a small amount of ice water into a plastic cup, inserted a sponge swab, and moistened her cracked lips. She swallowed hard, wincing as the cold liquid aggravated her swollen vocal cords. She cleared her throat, a faint gravelly sound in the quiet room. "My phone," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath but threaded with unmistakable authority. "Brenda has your phone," I informed her. "She confiscated it the night you were admitted. She told the nursing staff she was managing your communications to reduce your stress." Vivian's jaw tightened. The faint outline of a plan began to form behind her sharp gray eyes. She lifted her left hand, the side unaffected by the neurological event, and motioned for me to lean closer. "I need 2 things, she rasped, pausing to draw a shallow breath. "You will go to the house today. Do not let Brenda see you." In my home office, the bottom right drawer of the mahogany desk is locked. The key is taped beneath the bottom shelf of the bookcase. I nodded, committing the directions to memory. Inside that drawer is a small silver digital recorder. She continued, her voice gaining a fraction of strength with each word. I used it for dictating supply orders. "It is voice-activated. Bring it to me." "Understood." "What is the second thing?" Vivian locked her eyes onto mine. "You will use your phone to call Richard Caldwell. He has been my estate attorney for 30 years. Do not call his office. His personal cell phone number is written in the back of my address book, which is also in that desk drawer. You will tell Richard I am awake, and you will tell him I am ready to rewrite the terms of my survival." She sank back into the thin hospital pillow. Her breathing steady, her gaze fixed firmly on the door. I looked at the fragile woman hooked to intravenous lines and realized a profound truth. I was not standing beside a victim in need of rescue. I was receiving tactical orders from a general preparing to wage a terminal war. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, stood up from the chair, and prepared to breach my mother's stolen perimeter. The next phase of the treatment plan required me to gather the instruments of their destruction, and I had a very narrow window before Brenda returned to the stage. I timed my departure from the hospital to coincide with the annual autumn bake sale at the First Presbyterian Church. Brenda treated that specific charity event like a military deployment, meaning she would be heavily occupied with arranging cellophane-wrapped pastries and fielding compliments from her peers for at least 3 uninterrupted hours. I sent a brief, polite text to the family group chat stating I was heading to Vivian property to feed her senior rescue cat. The message provided an innocent, mundane cover for my tactical extraction, fitting perfectly into the helpful daughter role my relatives expected me to play. I navigated the quiet suburban streets of our town, parking a block away from the colonial house to avoid drawing attention from observant neighbors. In neighborhoods like ours, curtain twitching is a competitive sport, and any deviation from routine is cataloged for future gossip. I walked briskly up the driveway, unlocked the front door, and was immediately greeted by the low rumble of the aging feline. I filled the ceramic food bowl, poured fresh water, and waited for the cat to settle before moving deeper into the house. My alibi needed physical weight, just in case Brenda decided to conduct a surprise audit of my activities. Vivian home office sat off the main hallway. The room was preserved in the exact state she left it before the neurological event. Stacks of vendor invoices sat perfectly aligned on the edge of her heavy mahogany desk. I knelt beside the wooden structure, running my fingers along the underside of the bottom bookshelf exactly where she had instructed. I felt the rough texture of masking tape. I peeled the adhesive back, releasing a small, cold brass key into my palm. The key slid into the bottom right desk drawer with a satisfying mechanical click. Inside, resting beside a stack of crisp business envelopes, lay the items required to shift the balance of power. I grabbed the leather-bound address book and flipped to the back pages, photographing the personal cell phone number of Richard Caldwell. Next, I retrieved the digital recorder. It was a sleek silver device, roughly the size of a thumb drive, originally purchased to capture inventory dictations during late-night warehouse audits. It featured a high-sensitivity microphone and a voice activation switch. I checked the battery icon on the small liquid crystal display. Full charge. I slipped the device into the inner pocket of my jacket, locked the drawer, replaced the key under the shelf, and walked back out into the brisk afternoon air. Returning to the medical center, I bypassed the main elevators and took the staff stairwell to the intensive care unit. The afternoon shift change provided a natural lull in the corridor traffic, a brief window where nurses were distracted by handoff reports. I entered room 4 and locked the door behind me. Vivian was resting, her eyes closed, but the rhythm of her breathing shifted the moment I approached the bed. She knew I had returned. I pulled the silver recorder from my jacket. Without speaking a word, I flipped the toggle to activate the voice recognition mode. The screen blinked twice, confirming the internal mechanism was armed and ready to capture ambient sound. I carefully folded the device into the breast pocket of her standard-issue hospital robe. The fabric was thick enough to conceal the rectangular shape from casual observation, yet porous enough to allow clear audio transmission. Vivian opened her eyes, felt the weight of the device resting against her collarbone, and offered a single microscopic nod. The surveillance net was officially deployed. Our silent coordination was interrupted by a sharp, rapid knock on the door. Before I could turn the deadbolt, a master keycard engaged the lock from the outside. The heavy wooden door swung open, revealing my uncle. David looked frantic. His navy suit jacket was wrinkled, his tie loosened at the collar, and a thin sheen of perspiration coated his forehead. These were physiological markers of acute stress. In his right hand, he clutched a thick manila folder. He had bypassed the visitor desk, likely slipping through behind a distracted staff member. He stopped short when he saw me standing beside the bed. I noted the momentary flash of calculation in his eyes as he assessed my presence. He tried to quickly arrange his features into a mask of familial concern, deploying the classic Midwestern charm that usually saved him on the dealership floor. "Aurelia," he said, forcing a tight smile that barely stretched across his face. "I thought you went to feed the cat." "I finished the errand early," I replied, maintaining a neutral stance. I stepped subtly in front of Vivian, shielding her from his direct line of sight. "What brings you here during working hours, David?" He waved the manila folder in the air, attempting to project a breezy, casual demeanor. "I just need Mom to sign a few routine administrative forms. Insurance paperwork, mostly. Brenda mentioned she was finally awake, so I figured I would knock this out while she is still a bit groggy and compliant. It will save us all a headache down the road." I recognized the legal terminology printed on the visible edge of the top document protruding from the folder. It was a durable power of attorney. He was not here to file insurance claims. He was here to strip a vulnerable stroke victim of her remaining legal autonomy, while she was under the influence of heavy pain management medication. If Vivian signed that paper, David and Brenda would possess the unchecked authority to drain every bank account she owned, finalizing the theft they initiated with the jewelry collection. "She is not signing anything today," I stated, locking my knees and planting my feet firmly on the linoleum floor. The forced chuckle died in his throat. "Do not make this difficult, Aurelia. I am just trying to handle the business end of things so you can focus on her health. Just step aside and let me get a quick signature." I shifted my weight, transforming my body into a physical barrier. "As a healthcare provider in this facility, I am informing you that the patient is currently in a compromised cognitive state, following a major ischemic event," I said, weaponizing my professional vocabulary. Hospital policy strictly prohibits the execution of legal documents without a formal competency evaluation performed by the attending physician. If you attempt to place a pen in her hand right now, I will hit the call button page, the charge nurse, and have hospital security escort you off the premises for violating patient protocol. The polite veneer shattered. His face flushed a deep mottled red. The desperation he had been suppressing boiled over into naked hostility. He took a heavy step forward, closing the distance between us, trying to use his physical height to intimidate me. "You think you are so smart," he hissed, dropping the volume of his voice to a venomous whisper so the nurses in the hall would not hear. "You have always looked down on us, playing the perfect successful medical professional. You are trying to hoard her for yourself. You want to control the estate and cut me and your mother out of the picture. We are her children. We are handling this crisis and you need to get out of our way before you ruin everything." He was projecting his own motives onto me, a classic defensive mechanism used by individuals caught in a web of their own deceit. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his erratic energy. I simply maintained eye contact, staring at him with the cold, diagnostic detachment I reserve for uncooperative, combative patients. "The attending physician will conduct rounds in 10 minutes, I said, glancing at the clock on the wall. "Would you like to wait and discuss this legal paperwork with him, or would you prefer to leave now?" His jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched beneath his skin. He realized he was trapped. He could not force past me without causing a physical altercation, and causing a scene in the intensive care unit would invite unwanted scrutiny from the hospital administration. A public disturbance was the antithesis of the narrative he and Brenda were trying to construct for the community. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest. "This is not over," he muttered. He shoved the manila folder under his arm, spun on his heel, and marched out of the room. The heavy door clicking shut behind him. I listened to his footsteps echo down the corridor until they faded into the ambient noise of the ward. I turned back to look at Vivian. Her eyes were sharp, reflecting the fluorescent light, having witnessed the entire exchange in calculating silence. We both understood the implication of his erratic behavior. He was panicked. The auction was looming, and the auction house likely required a signed power of attorney to release the final funds from the liquidated collection. By physically blocking his path today, I had triggered a complication in their timeline. They could no longer wait for the natural progression of events. They were going to accelerate their plans, pushing to finalize the financial transfer before Vivian could fully recover her voice and her strength. The disease was spreading faster than anticipated, which meant our cure needed to be swift, precise, and fatal to their operation. The hospital cafeteria on a Thursday afternoon is a study in sensory deprivation. The lighting is an unforgiving fluorescent white. The air carries the faint scent of boiled vegetables and floor wax. I sat at a small laminate table in the far corner, a cup of tepid black coffee resting beside my open laptop. I had connected to the Public Medical Center network and navigated to the Chicago Estate auction portal. The live bidding event was already underway. In my daily practice as a physician assistant, I am trained to monitor a patient's status through digital interfaces. I watch lines trace across screens to verify cardiac rhythms. I read numerical values to confirm oxygen saturation. Today, I was watching a different kind of metric. I was monitoring the real-time liquidation of my grandmother legacy. The auction interface featured a clean, minimalist design. A high-resolution photograph of each item occupied the left side of the screen, while a scrolling ledger of bids cascaded down the right. I opened a blank spreadsheet document on my desktop, preparing to chart the financial data with the same rigorous exactitude I apply to a medical history. Lot 412 appeared on the screen, the vintage sapphire and diamond pendant. Vivian had purchased that specific piece in 1994, shortly after she secured a lucrative regional distribution contract for commercial-grade power tools. It was a physical marker of her triumph in a male-dominated industry. Now, an anonymous bidder in a different time zone was offering $45,000 for it. The digital hammer flashed on the screen. Sold. I typed the number into my spreadsheet. Lot 413 populated next. The articulated gold bracelet. She bought that one a decade ago, celebrating her remission from early-stage breast cancer. The bidding war for the bracelet was swift and detached. Two opposing paddles drove the price up in increments of $1,000. It closed at $38,000. I logged the data, keeping my fingers steady on the keyboard. For the next 2 hours, I sat in that sterile corner and watched pieces of Vivian life vanish into the digital ether. Rings, brooches, antique timepieces. Each item carried a specific memory, a distinct victory in a life defined by relentless hard work. My family had seized these artifacts and transformed them into untraceable capital. They were auctioning off the hardware store profits, the sleepless nights, the sheer grit it took for a widowed mother to build an empire. When the final item closed, I highlighted the column of hammer prices and ran a sum function. The total formulated at the bottom of the screen. $220,000. I closed the laptop, placed it in my bag, and discarded my cold coffee. I rode the elevator back up to the intensive care unit, feeling the distinct weight of the objective data I now possessed. The theft was no longer theoretical. The physical assets had been successfully converted into cash. The secondary phase of their operation was complete. I bypassed the nursing station and entered room 4, locking the door behind me. Vivian was resting in a semi-upright position, the automated bed adjusted to ease the strain on her recovering lungs. Her silver hair was brushed back from her forehead. She looked at me, her sharp gray eyes clear and expectant. I approached the bedside, speaking in a low, measured register. The auction concluded 10 minutes ago, I informed her, presenting the data like a set of recent lab results. Every piece sold. The gross total reached $220,000. Vivian did not flinch. She did not display a single physiological marker of distress. The heart monitor beside her bed maintained a steady, even rhythm. She absorbed the sum, processing the scope of her children's greed. She tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the financial reality. Brenda texted the family group chat while I was downstairs. I continued slipping my phone from my pocket to review the message. She just finished her church bake sale and is on her way to the hospital. She claims she wants to spend some quiet quality time with you before the evening shift change. Vivian's gaze shifted toward the small silver digital recorder I had concealed inside the breast pocket of her hospital robe earlier that day. The fabric draped naturally over the device, rendering it invisible to casual observation. She reached up with her unaffected hand, her fingers brushing the cloth to verify its position. In nature, certain organisms survive by feigning weakness, luring predators into a false sense of security before striking. In the clinical setting, we sometimes see patients use a similar tactic, minimizing their capabilities to observe how their families react to their perceived decline. Vivian was about to employ a masterful diagnostic deception. "Let her come," Vivian whispered, her voice still a raw rasp from the breathing tube. Her jaw set into a firm line. "We will give her the audience she wants." I retreated to the visitor chair in the corner of the room, opening a medical journal to construct my own alibi. Less than 15 minutes later, the heavy wooden door swung open. Brenda stepped into the room, bringing the scent of vanilla extract and self-importance with her. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, projecting the aura of a woman holding her life together through sheer willpower and faith. She paused near the doorway, offering me a tight, pitying smile. "You must be exhausted, Aurelia," she murmured, her tone dripping with that signature Iowa nice condescension. "Why don't you step out and grab some fresh air? I can sit with your grandmother for a while." I shook my head, keeping my eyes fixed on my journal. "I am catching up on some continuing education credits," I replied smoothly. "I prefer the quiet in here." Brenda pressed her lips together, clearly annoyed that her private stage was occupied, but she could not force me to leave without breaching her polite facade. She walked to the side of the bed, leaning over the rail. Vivian executed her performance flawlessly. She let her facial muscles go slack, softening the sharp intelligence that usually defined her expression. She allowed her eyes to wander aimlessly around the room, mimicking the profound cognitive fog typical of a severe stroke survivor. She let out a soft, confused sigh, shifting her weight weakly against the mattress. Brenda fell for it instantly. She reached out, stroking Vivian's hand with slow, exaggerated motions. "Oh, Mom." Brenda cooed, adopting the sing-song voice people reserve for infants and the dying. "You look so tired today. You just need to rest your mind. Everything is going to be okay." Vivian blinked slowly, turning her head toward Brenda. Her voice was a fragile, trembling whisper. The house, she murmured, playing the role of the disoriented elder, terrified of financial ruin. The bills. Brenda's eyes lit up. She saw the opening she had been waiting for. The opportunity to play the savior to a mother she believed was no longer capable of tracking her own assets. Brenda leaned in closer, bringing her face inches from Vivian's chest. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, unaware of the high-sensitivity microphone resting just beneath the fabric of the robe. "Shh, do not worry about any of that, Mom." Brenda whispered, her tone thick with manufactured reassurance. "David and I took care of everything. We knew you were worried about the costs, so we went into your safe and handled the jewelry just like you wanted. We sent it to an auction house in Chicago this morning. We are going to put all that money into a safe account for your memory care facility." The red light on the digital recorder pulsed silently beneath the cotton weave, a tiny diode gathering irrefutable evidence. "You are safe now," Brenda continued, gently patting Vivian's hand. "The money is safe with us. You do not have to think about a single financial decision ever again. David and I are managing the estate from here on out. You just focus on resting your poor brain." Vivian let out another frail sigh, closing her eyes as if the information was simply too much to process. Brenda straightened her posture, a look of profound satisfaction settling across her features. She had delivered her narrative, she had established her control, and she believed she had secured her mother's blessing for a felony. She turned toward me, her face rearranging itself back into the mask of the burdened caregiver. "She is fading in and out," Brenda whispered to me, shaking her head tragically. "It breaks my heart to see her mind slipping like this." I looked up from my journal, meeting my mother gaze with perfect clinical detachment. "It is a difficult transition," I agreed, keeping my voice entirely devoid of inflection. Brenda checked her wristwatch, noting the approaching rush hour traffic. "I should get home and prepare dinner for your father. She needs her sleep anyway." She offered me one final patronizing smile, gathered her handbag, and walked out of the intensive care unit. The heavy door clicked shut behind her. I waited 10 seconds to ensure she was out of earshot. I stood up and walked to the side of the bed. Vivian opened her eyes. The frail, disoriented elder vanished, replaced instantly by the formidable matriarch who built an empire. She reached into the pocket of her robe, retrieved the silver recorder, and pressed the stop button. The digital screen saved the audio file. Brenda had just entered the room, believing she was the architect of a flawless crime. She walked out utterly unaware that she had just handed us the murder weapon. The drive from the hospital to the downtown legal district took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing a border between two different worlds. I had arranged my clinical schedule to create a 2-hour window, telling the charge nurse I needed to review a batch of complex orthopedic imaging at an off-site facility. In the medical field, administrative duties provide the perfect camouflage. My white coat and laminated badge served as an unquestionable alibi, allowing me to slip away from the ward without triggering Brenda radar. Richard Caldwell operated his law practice out of a brick building that had anchored the corner of Elm and Maple for nearly a century. He was a foundational pillar of the Iowa legal community, a man who sponsored local charity drives, served on the Rotary Club, and understood the exact weight of a family reputation. His office reflected this heritage. It featured rich oak paneling shelves lined with heavy leather-bound volumes, and a thick Persian rug that swallowed the sound of my footsteps. Vivian and Caldwell had shared a professional relationship for 3 decades. He drafted the original incorporation papers for her hardware supply company and structured the trust that protected her assets during turbulent economic downturns. He knew her character. He respected her resilience. He also knew Brenda and David, having observed their fiscal habits from a polite professional distance over the years. His assistant ushered me into the inner office. Caldwell sat behind a broad mahogany desk wearing a tailored gray suit and an expression of quiet observation. He stood up, offering a firm handshake, bypassing the superficial pleasantries that usually waste time in our town. "Your grandmother requested this consultation," I said, taking a seat in a high-back leather chair. "She is awake, her cognition is fully intact, and she instructed me to bring you a specific set of data." Caldwell folded his hands on his desk, leaning forward slightly to indicate his full attention. "Proceed." I opened my bag and retrieved the manila folder I had compiled the night before. I approached this presentation exactly like a complex case review with an attending physician. I did not offer emotional commentary. I offered verified documentation. I slid the first stack of paper across the polished wood surface. "This is the manifest from an estate auction held in Chicago yesterday afternoon," I explained, keeping my vocal register perfectly even. "The items listed are the contents of Vivian Floor safe. Brenda and David extracted the collection while she was intubated. They authorized the sale. The gross total reached $220,000. Caldwell reviewed the printed spreadsheets, his eyes tracking the high-resolution photographs and the final hammer prices. His brow furrowed a fraction of an inch, the only outward sign of his reaction. I placed the second document beside the first. "This is a copy of Vivian Premium Supplemental Health Insurance Policy. As you already know, it covers all long-term care, rehabilitation, and in-home nursing without exception. Brenda is currently informing our extended relatives and her congregation that she ordered the liquidation to save the estate from impending medical bankruptcy. She is establishing a false narrative of financial ruin to justify the asset seizure." Caldwell tapped a gold pen against a legal pad. He was assembling the pieces of the liability puzzle, recognizing the shape of the deceit. He looked up, his expression hardening. "They are anticipating a lengthy recovery period. They expect to have the funds cleared and dispersed before Vivian can audit her own accounts." "They made a critical error," I said, reaching into my bag for the final piece of evidence. "They assumed her temporary lack of speech meant a lack of comprehension." I placed the silver digital recorder on the center of the desk. I pressed the playback button. The quiet acoustics of the oak-paneled office amplified the audio file. Brenda's voice filled the room, dripping with that trademark condescending sweetness. The recording captured every word she whispered into Vivian's ear in the intensive care unit. The confession of breaking into the safe. The confirmation of the Chicago auction. The promise to deposit the money into a supposedly secure account managed by David and herself. The patronizing instruction for Vivian to simply stop thinking about her own finances. The audio clip ended. The silence that followed was profound. Caldwell reached up and slowly removed his reading glasses, letting them rest on the papers. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long, measured breath. In his 30 years of practice in this community, he had drafted countless wills and mediated dozens of bitter inheritance disputes. But the brazen nature of this operation, executed while the victim was literally on life support, crossed a boundary that even a seasoned attorney found jarring. "What they have done," Caldwell said, his voice dropping into a register of cold legal authority, "is not a simple family misunderstanding. Under our state statutes, this constitutes severe elder financial abuse. By transferring assets across state lines to a Chicago auction house without a valid power of attorney, they have committed felony fraud." He picked up his pen and began outlining a list on the legal pad. "The stakes here are not just financial restitution. The stakes are state prison." I watched him write, feeling the diagnostic pieces align. "So we file an injunction," I suggested. "We contact the auction house, freeze the payout, and demand the return of the funds to Vivian estate." Caldwell stopped writing. He looked at me, a sharp glint of tactical brilliance shining in his eyes. He shook his head. "If we freeze the transfer now," he explained, "Brenda and David will retain plausible deniability. They will hire a defense attorney who will argue that they were acting out of misguided panic. They will claim they intended to put the money in a trust for Vivian care. And because the funds never actually reached their personal accounts, a sympathetic judge might view it as an attempted intervention rather than a completed theft. They would face civil penalties, perhaps, but they would evade the criminal threshold. They would spin the narrative to the town, painting Vivian as ungrateful and you as vindictive. As he tapped the digital recorder. "We are not going to interrupt the transaction. We are going to let them complete it. I processed the strategy, recognizing the elegance of the maneuver. In medicine, sometimes you have to let a localized infection draw to a head before you lance it, ensuring you extract the entire core. The auction house will issue the payment within the next few business days. Caldwell continued. We will allow Brenda and David to receive that wire transfer. We will let them deposit the $220,000 into their own bank accounts. The moment those funds clear into an account, they control the felony is cemented. The crime is no longer theoretical or attempted. It is executed. I felt a cold thrill at the precision of the trap. We let them dig the hole, I murmured, echoing Vivian's exact sentiment. All the way to the bottom, Caldwell confirmed. He opened a fresh file folder on his desk and began drafting the instruments of their destruction. The legal mechanisms required careful sequencing. He outlined a demand letter that would trigger the moment the trap snapped shut. He prepared formal notices to the local authorities and the banking institutions ready to be dispatched the second the funds landed. He also drafted an emergency revocation of all current estate directives, legally excising Brenda and David from any future claim to Vivian medical or financial decisions. I will need to visit the hospital to secure Vivian's signature on these revocations, Caldwell said, his pen moving swiftly across the paper. We must establish her legal competency on the record. I will bring a notary and an independent physician to verify her cognitive state. Once these are filed, Brenda and David will have zero legal standing to contest her discharge or her subsequent living arrangements. The plan was airtight. It removed the emotional volatility from the equation and replaced it with cold, hard statutory law. Brenda had built her entire life around the perception of moral superiority. She relied on the community's polite refusal to look beneath the surface. By allowing the wire transfer to complete, Caldwell was constructing a scenario that could not be swept under the rug. Bank fraud algorithms and police reports do not care about church bake sales or polite smiles. I sat back in the leather chair and watched the attorney work. The anxiety of the past few days evaporated. It was replaced by the crisp, satisfying sensation of a complex lock tumbling into place. My mother and uncle believed they were operating in the shadows, orchestrating a perfect crime while the rest of us were distracted by grief. They had no idea they were walking into a brightly lit corridor with no exit. Caldwell finished the preliminary drafts and closed the file. He looked at me, his expression grave but resolute. They will likely try to stage a celebration when she is discharged, he noted, anticipating the behavioral patterns of narcissists. They will want to present the liquidated funds as a heroic gift to cement their control. I nodded, recognizing the exact shape of my mother's psychology. They are planning a family dinner, I said. Brenda wants an audience. Then we will give them an audience, Caldwell replied, setting his gold pen down. We wait for the money to land. Then we spring the trap. The medical chart reached its final page on a Friday morning. The attending neurologist entered room 4, conducted a brief neurological exam, and signed the official discharge orders. Vivian passed every cognitive test with clinical precision. Her speech retained a slight gravelly texture from the intubation, but the syllables formed sharp, coherent sentences. The hospital machinery was systematically detached. The intravenous lines were removed. The pulse oximeter was unclipped, and the rhythmic chiming of the cardiac monitor ceased. The sudden absence of those digital sounds left a ringing silence in the room, signaling the transition from acute trauma back to the unpredictable terrain of ordinary life. Brenda and David timed their arrival to coincide with this transition. They swept into the intensive care unit like visiting dignitaries, bringing a synthetic wave of cheap floral perfume and unwarranted confidence. Brenda wore a pristine ivory blouse and a matching cardigan, her face painted with a serene, triumphant smile. She functioned much like a localized infection that had managed to breach the host immune system, radiating a toxic, smug satisfaction. David trailed behind her, and his physiological markers had undergone a radical shift. The frantic, nervous perspiration that coated his forehead days earlier had vanished. His posture was no longer hunched under the invisible weight of debt collectors. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, checking a new notification on his smartphone with a casual flick of his wrist. I recognized the swagger immediately. It was the physical manifestation of a cleared wire transfer. The auction house funds had landed in their accounts. The felony Richard Caldwell predicted was no longer a theoretical scheme. It was a completed transaction. My mother immediately seized control of the airspace. She approached the transport chair where Vivian sat and clapped her hands together in a gesture of pious joy. "We have the most beautiful evening planned for you," Brenda announced, projecting her voice so the nursing staff at the central station could hear her devotion. "You are coming straight to my house. David and I have organized a welcome home dinner. The whole family is gathering to celebrate this miracle. We have so much to discuss, and we have a wonderful surprise to share regarding your future care." The demand was packaged as a loving invitation, but it possessed the rigid structure of a hostage situation. Brenda had a long documented history of hijacking family milestones. When I graduated from my medical program, she turned the celebratory dinner into a networking event for her church committee, ensuring she received the primary accolades for raising a successful daughter. She utilized other people's achievements and vulnerabilities as raw material to construct her own social pedestal. Today, she intended to use my grandmother's stroke recovery as the ultimate stage to present herself as the savior of our family legacy. Vivian looked at Brenda, her gray eyes narrowing a fraction of an inch. She did not argue. She merely offered a slow, compliant nod, playing the part of the exhausted, dependent elder perfectly. I stood by the wardrobe, packing Vivian's personal belongings into a small canvas overnight bag. I moved with deliberate, methodical slowness, acting the role of the obedient, sidelined assistant. I folded her slippers, her reading glasses, and her toiletry kit. Then I reached into my scrub pocket. My fingers wrapped around the smooth silver casing of the voice-activated digital recorder. I slipped the device into the inner lining of Vivian's heavy wool cardigan, securing it deep within the pocket where the fabric would mask its silhouette, but allow the high-sensitivity microphone to capture every sound in the dining room. I handed the cardigan to Vivian. She slipped her arms into the sleeves, her fingers brushing the hidden device to confirm its position. Our eyes met for a fleeting second. No words were exchanged, but the tactical confirmation passed between us. The payload was armed. David grabbed the handles of the transport chair, eager to play the dutiful son for the hospital audience. Brenda walked ahead of them, waving polite goodbyes to the charge nurse and leaving a trail of synthetic gratitude in her wake. I trailed behind the procession, carrying the canvas bag, maintaining my mask of quiet exhaustion. I broke away from this group near the main lobby, stating I needed to fetch my vehicle from the overflow parking structure and would meet them at the patient loading zone. I stepped into the empty elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. The steel doors slid shut, isolating me in the small mirrored compartment. My smartphone vibrated in my pocket. I unlocked the screen and opened the family group chat. The notification was a long, meticulously crafted paragraph from Brenda, broadcast to every cousin, aunt, and distant relative in our Iowa network. "Praise God for His infinite mercy," the message began. "Our beloved matriarch is officially discharged and recovering beautifully. David and I are bringing her to my home tonight for a special family dinner. We have navigated some incredibly turbulent waters this week, making the tough sacrifices required to protect her legacy. We cannot wait to reveal a beautiful surprise tonight that secures her comfort for years to come. God is good." I stood in the descending elevator and read the text twice. I analyzed the syntax, the performative religious humility, the subtle framing of their theft as a protective sacrifice. A genuine smile broke across my face, cracking the rigid clinical detachment I had maintained for days. I had to press my hand over my mouth to suppress a sharp, involuntary laugh. Hubris is a fascinating psychological condition. In clinical terms, it resembles a tumor that secretes its own growth hormones, feeding itself until it becomes so bloated it compresses the vital organs surrounding it. Brenda and David were drunk on their perceived success. They believed they had outsmarted a regional business tycoon, a licensed medical professional, and the entire banking system. They were so confident in their own narrative that they were actively inviting an audience to witness their victory lap. They were setting the stage for their own public execution. I composed my features, forcing the smile down, and stepped out of the elevator. The crisp autumn air hit my face as I walked across the concrete parking structure. The scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke replaced the sterile odor of the hospital ward. I drove my sedan to the loading zone where David was awkwardly assisting Vivian into the passenger seat of my car. He patted the roof of the vehicle, offering me a patronizing wink. "Drive safe, Aurelia," David said, his voice slick with unearned authority. "We will see you at the house. Do not be late. We have big news to share." I nodded mutely, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of a verbal response. I closed the passenger door, walked around the hood, and slid into the driver's seat. I put the car in gear and merged onto the main thoroughfare, leaving Brenda and David in my rearview mirror as they climbed into their respective luxury vehicles. The drive to Brenda House took 25 minutes. The route carried us past the sprawling golden cornfields that bordered our town, the stalks dried and waiting for the harvest. The vast open Iowa landscape stretched out under a pale blue sky, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic tension of the hospital room we had occupied for the past week. We drove in silence for the first few miles. The rhythmic thumping of the tires over the asphalt joints provided a steady, calming cadence. I kept my eyes on the road, navigating the familiar turns, feeling the weight of the impending confrontation settling into my shoulders. We were driving directly into the epicenter of the infection. Vivian sat beside me, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. She watched the local landmarks slide by. The old water tower, the sprawling brick high school, the small community bank where she had opened her first commercial checking account 4 decades ago. She was measuring the town she had helped build, the community that was about to witness a seismic disruption. I turned the steering wheel, taking the final exit that led toward the affluent suburban subdivision where Brenda lived. The manicured lawns and identical brick facades of the neighborhood came into view. I pulled a steady breath into my lungs. "They think they won," I said, keeping my voice low, speaking to the dashboard. "They are going to hand you a check tonight and expect you to thank them for it." Vivian did not turn her head. She continued to watch the sprawling manicured lawns pass outside her window. She reached her unaffected hand into the pocket of her wool cardigan, her fingers tracing the outline of the silver device hidden within the fabric. The corners of her mouth twitched, forming a cold, calculating expression that belonged to a predator patiently waiting for its prey to step into the snare. "Let them," Vivian stated, her gravelly voice cutting through the quiet hum of the car engine. "Let them dig the hole all the way to the bottom before we throw the dirt in." I parked my sedan in Brenda's immaculate driveway, the tires crunching softly against the pristine gravel. The exterior of her house featured symmetrical landscaping and warm porch lights projecting an image of welcoming domesticity. We stepped through the front door and the rich scent of slow-roasted beef and rosemary greeted us. The environment was curated to disarm. Brenda had orchestrated the setting to ensure her upcoming performance possessed the correct visual weight. She wanted the domestic warmth to validate her pronouncements and smother any potential dissent. The dining room table was set for a formal occasion. Crystal wine glasses caught the light from the overhead chandelier. The good silver, polished to a high mirror shine, flanked bone china plates with delicate gold rims. Linen napkins sat folded into sharp, precise triangles. A centerpiece of fresh autumn flowers occupied the middle of the table, creating a slight visual barrier between the seats. In an Iowa dining room staged this meticulously, raising one voice or causing a scene is considered the ultimate social failure. Brenda was counting on the weight of the silverware and the presence of the crystal to enforce civility and keep Vivian compliant. We sat down. Brenda placed Vivian at the head of the table, a symbolic gesture intended to flatter the victim. I took the seat to Vivian right. David sat directly across from me. He poured red wine into the crystal glasses with a theatrical flourish, his movements loose and unusually buoyant. In the clinical setting, you learn to identify the specific behavioral patterns of patients exhibiting drug-seeking behavior. When an individual attempts to secure an early refill for a controlled substance, they never simply ask for the medication. They construct an elaborate, unsolicited narrative. They excessively praise the medical staff, they detail their endless personal suffering, and they present themselves as the tragic victims of unfair circumstances. They talk too much, their hands flutter with nervous energy, and their pupils dilate from the adrenaline of the deception. Sitting at that dining room table, I watched my mother and uncle exhibit every single one of those clinical markers. They passed the mashed potatoes and the gravy boat, dominating the conversation with forced, cheerful anecdotes. They spoke rapidly, filling every pocket of silence with hollow laughter and exaggerated tales of how hard they had worked over the past week to keep the family afloat. They were overcompensating, vibrating with the nervous thrill of a completed theft. I sliced a piece of roast beef on my plate, applying even pressure to the knife. I did not look up. I simply chewed my food and charted their symptoms. Halfway through the meal, Brenda picked up her silver butter knife and tapped it against the rim of her wine glass. The sharp, clear chime brought the manic chatter to an abrupt halt. Brenda stood up, smoothing the front of her ivory blouse. She lowered her chin, adopting a practiced expression of solemn gratitude. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate a true miracle." Brenda began pitching her voice to convey a delicate emotional tremor. "This past week tested our family in ways we never imagined. When Mom suffered her stroke, David and I realized how fragile our foundation truly was. We faced a terrifying reality. The thought of losing our matriarch or seeing her beautiful legacy drained by medical debt and memory care facilities kept us awake at night." She placed a hand over her heart, looking down at Vivian with a gaze full of synthetic pity. "But family steps up," Brenda continued. "Family makes the hard choices. We endure the sleepless nights to protect the ones we love. Mom, you spent your entire life building a safety net for us. David and I decided it was our turn to build a safety net for you. We stepped in to secure your future." David pushed his chair back and stood up beside her. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and smoothed it flat on the pristine tablecloth. It was a printed bank statement from a joint account he shared with Brenda. "We took a proactive approach," David announced, puffing his chest out as he addressed the room. "We secured your assets before the hospital billing department or the state could touch them. We contacted a premium estate liquidator in Chicago and auctioned the contents of your floor safe. It was a tough call, Mom. We knew you loved those pieces, but we negotiated hard on your behalf. We squeezed every dime out of those buyers." He tapped the bank statement with his index finger, his face flushed with triumph. $220,000, he declared. Safe and sound in a protected account. We saved the estate. They stood there side by side, expecting a standing ovation. They had taken a premeditated felony and gift wrapped it in the guise of profound familial devotion. They weaponized our local culture, trusting that Vivian would nod, swallow her pride to avoid a scene, and accept their fabricated heroism. Brenda reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced a standard personal checkbook. She uncapped a pen and began to write, her manicured fingers moving swiftly across the paper. "We want you to have peace of mind," Brenda said, her voice dripping with maternal condescension. "You never have to worry about a single bill again. We have established a management trust. David and I will handle all the complex financial burdens, the property taxes, the insurance premiums, and your daily expenses. We are taking that heavy weight off your shoulders." She tore the check from the ledger and slid it across the polished wood, stopping just inches from Vivian's plate. I glanced at the numbers written in blue ink. The check was made out to Vivian for $25,000. "This is your personal allowance to start," Brenda explained, offering a bright synthetic smile. "Just a little walking around money for whatever you need. The remainder of the auction funds will stay in our management account. We had to deduct the auction house commissions, the expedited transport fees, and a standard percentage for David time managing this crisis. The rest is safely tucked away for your future care." Brenda ticked the fabricated expenses off on her fingers. She claimed the auction house took an exorbitant emergency processing fee because David insisted on a rush sale to secure the assets. She cited state tax withholdings, secure transport costs, and legal retainer fees she claimed they had to pay to protect the estate from the hospital. Finally, She argued that David had taken significant time away from his auto dealership to manage this crisis, and it was only fair that he be compensated for his lost commission wages. I calculated the math in my head. They were stealing $195,000 and calling it a management fee. It was an astonishing display of arrogance. They were effectively charging Vivian a premium rate to endure her own robbery. They expected her to express gratitude for the fraction they left behind. I set my knife down and folded my hands in my lap. I turned my head to observe Vivian. She sat perfectly still at the head of the table. The warm light from the chandelier caught the silver strands in her hair. She looked at the personal check resting on the white tablecloth. She did not reach for it. She did not utter a single word of thanks. The silence in the dining room stretched past the boundaries of social comfort. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. In the medical field, silence is an effective diagnostic tool. When you deliver a difficult prognosis, you stay quiet and watch how the patient processes the information. Vivian was using silence to dissect them. She did not move a single muscle. The stillness radiating from her was profound. David shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his confidence evaporating under her unbroken stare. His breathing grew shallow. Brenda reached for her wine glass, her hand trembling just enough to make the dark red liquid inside ripple against the crystal. The triumphant energy they had cultivated all evening hit a solid wall of ice. The air in the room turned sharp and heavy, pressing down on the untouched food and the polished silver. The ambush had reached its peak, and the room waited for the matriarch to breathe. The silence in the dining room thickened into a physical barrier. In an orthopedic clinic, when a patient waits to hear if a bone requires surgical intervention, their breathing changes. The respirations become shallow, rapid, and restricted by anticipating pain. Sitting at the table, I watched my mother and uncle adopt that exact respiratory pattern. They were waiting for Vivian to express her gratitude. They were waiting for the validation their carefully constructed narrative demanded. Vivian did not offer it. She looked at the personal check resting on the pristine white tablecloth. She looked at the fabricated bank statement David had so proudly displayed. Then she lifted her silver fork. She did not throw it. She did not strike the table in anger. She moved with deliberate, unhurried precision, lowering the utensil until it rested in the exact center of her bone china plate. The metal made a sharp, definitive click against the porcelain. That single sound shattered the manufactured warmth of the room. Vivian reached her unaffected left hand into the deep pocket of her heavy wool cardigan. She wore that specific sweater for years while conducting inventory audits in cold hardware warehouses. It was a garment associated with labor and endurance. Her fingers bypassed a folded tissue and retrieved the silver digital recorder I had planted hours earlier. She brought her hand up and set the device on the table, placing it right next to the $25,000 check Brenda had offered as a consolation prize. The polished silver casing reflected the light from the overhead chandelier. David stared at the unfamiliar object, his brow furrowing as his brain attempted to classify the threat. Brenda tilted her head, her polite smile faltering her eyes, darting between the device and her mother. They did not recognize the instrument, but their primal instincts signaled that the environment had just become hostile. Vivian extended her index finger. She pressed the playback button. The small internal speaker crackled to life, emitting a brief second of static hiss before projecting crisp, clear audio across the dining room. Brenda's own voice filled the space. It was not the confident, booming tone she had just used to present her speech. It was the saccharine, patronizing whisper she had deployed in the intensive care unit while she believed Vivian was suffering from severe cognitive decline. "Do not worry about any of that, Mom." The recorded voice murmured the syllables dripping with false comfort. "David and I took care of everything. We knew you were worried about the costs, so we went into your safe and handled the jewelry just like you wanted. We sent it to an auction house in Chicago this morning. We are going to put all that money into a safe account for your memory care facility. You are safe now. The money is safe with us." The audio clip finished. Vivian pressed the stop button. The mechanical click echoed in the quiet room. The physiological response was instantaneous and profound. As a medical practitioner, I am trained to identify the biological markers of acute panic. When the human brain perceives an inescapable threat, the sympathetic nervous system initiates a fight-or-flight response. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream, forcing the body to prioritize essential functions. I watched this process execute in real time across David's face. The arrogance that had inflated his posture just moments ago evaporated. His peripheral blood vessels constricted, draining the color from his cheeks and leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. The pupils of his eyes dilated, turning into wide, dark pools of terror. He tried to swallow, but his salivary glands had ceased production. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life talking his way out of missed sales quotas and delayed loan payments. He relied on his charm to blur the lines of reality. But empirical evidence cannot be charmed. You cannot gaslight a digital audio file. He stared at the silver recorder, his jaw hanging slightly ajar. His vocal cords paralyzed by the sheer weight of his own captured confession. Brenda's reaction was far more severe. Her entire identity rested on her local reputation. She spent decades curating an image of spotless civic virtue, using her church committee status to shield her transactional cruelty. That reputation was her armor. The audio recording had just pierced it, exposing the dark, hollow core beneath her pastel cardigans. She lost her fine motor control. Her hands began to tremble so noticeably that she had to brace them against the edge of the dining table. The tremor traveled up her arms, vibrating through her shoulders. She pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor, and staggered backward. She reached blindly behind her until her fingers found the wooden trim of the dining room archway. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles turning bone white, using the structural support to physically keep herself from collapsing. Her knees buckled slightly under the sudden lack of oxygen to her brain. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as she struggled to formulate a defense. In her world, every action could be justified if presented with the correct, polite phrasing. She attempted to deploy her usual tactics, desperate to regain control of a narrative that had already slipped through her fingers. "That is not what it sounds like," Brenda stammered, her voice pitched high and erratic. "You are misunderstanding the context. I was only trying to soothe you. You were in distress in the hospital, and I was using comforting words to calm your nerves. David and I were protecting you from the stress of the estate management. We did this out of love. We were saving your legacy." She sounded like a cornered animal attempting to bargain with a snare. Her linguistic gymnastics were pathetic, a transparent attempt to apply her typical Iowa nice spin to a documented felony. She looked at David silently, begging him to corroborate her improvised defense, but David remained frozen in his chair, his eyes fixed blankly on his untouched roast beef. Vivian did not raise her voice. She did not exhibit anger. She maintained the same cold, diagnostic detachment I strive for in my own clinical practice. She looked at her daughter, her gray eyes devoid of any maternal warmth. She saw a woman who had eagerly planned to strip her of her dignity, her assets, and her autonomy the moment her heart fluttered. "You did not sell my jewelry, Brenda," Vivian stated, her gravelly voice cutting through the suffocating tension in the room. "You sold your own future." The sentence landed with the finality of a terminal diagnosis. It carried no room for negotiation. It offered no path for reconciliation. Vivian was formally excising the diseased tissue from her life. Brenda opened her mouth to protest, a fresh wave of fabricated tears welling in her eyes, but the sound died in her throat. Before she could launch another desperate plea, a sharp, resonant tone cut through the silence. The front doorbell rang. It was a crisp, clear chime that echoed down the hallway, signaling the arrival of the next phase of our treatment plan. I checked my wristwatch. It was exactly on time. I stood up from my chair, folded my linen napkin, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I looked at my mother, who was still clinging to the archway, her eyes darting toward the foyer in blind panic. "I will answer that," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "I believe our final guest has arrived to conclude this family meeting." I stepped away from the dining table, leaving my mother clinging to the wooden archway. Her respiratory rate was erratic, resembling a patient entering the preliminary stages of hyperventilation. The polished hardwood floor muffled my footsteps as I walked down the short corridor to the foyer. I reached for the brass handle and pulled the heavy front door open. The cool autumn air spilled into the entryway, bringing a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the house. Richard Caldwell stood on the porch under the warm, amber glow of the exterior carriage lights. He wore a charcoal gray suit tailored to project unyielding authority. In his right hand, he carried a vintage leather briefcase, its edges worn smooth from decades of navigating probate courts and contentious estate battles. He did not look like a dinner guest. He looked like an auditor arriving to inspect a condemned structure. He offered a single curt nod of acknowledgement and stepped across the threshold, bringing the unforgiving weight of the legal system directly into Brenda's carefully curated domestic sanctuary. I closed the door and led him toward the dining room. Brenda was still anchored to the doorframe. When she registered the identity of the man walking down her hallway, the remaining color drained from her face. She recognized Caldwell immediately. Everyone in our community knew him. He was the kind of attorney who handled the silent, expensive crises of the town elite. Brenda tried to formulate a greeting, a desperate reflex to reassert her host status, but only a dry, incoherent rasp escaped her throat. Caldwell did not break his stride. He bypassed her entirely, treating her presence as a minor obstacle in a surgical field. He approached the dining table and surveyed the scene. He noted the fine china, the half-empty crystal wine glasses, and the pristine linen napkins. His eyes settled on the items resting in the center of the table. The $25,000 check, the fabricated bank statement, the silver digital recorder. Caldwell placed his heavy leather briefcase directly onto the polished mahogany surface, uncaring if the metal hinges scratched the wood. The loud, dull thud of the briefcase making contact with the table finalized the transition of the room. It was no longer a space for family celebrations. It was a tribunal. Caldwell popped the brass latches and opened the case. He withdrew a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in the measured clinical cadence of a specialist delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Good evening." Caldwell stated, his gaze shifting between my mother in the doorway and my uncle frozen in his chair. Vivian requested my presence here tonight to address a severe irregularity regarding her financial portfolio. David attempted a recovery maneuver. His survival instinct, honed by years of manipulating auto financing contracts, kicked in. Richard David said, forcing a tight, nervous chuckle that died in the heavy air. "This is a private family matter. We are just having a welcome home dinner. There is a misunderstanding here, but we can clear it up without involving outside counsel." "There is no misunderstanding," David Caldwell replied, smoothly laying the first document flat on the table. He pressed his index finger against the typed text. "What I have here are the printed statutes of the Iowa Code pertaining to the financial exploitation of a vulnerable elder." Caldwell's tone dropped a register, turning sharp and cold. "Let me provide a clear translation of your current standing. 3 days ago, while your mother was incapacitated on a ventilator, you and Brenda bypassed a secure safe. You orchestrated the transportation of $220,000 worth of assets across state lines to a Chicago auction house. You executed these contracts without an active verified power of attorney. This morning, you received a wire transfer from that auction house, and you deposited those funds into a joint checking account under your own names." David opened his mouth to interrupt, ready to deploy the excuse of securing funds for her medical care, but Caldwell raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "The moment that wire transfer cleared your bank this morning, the crime ceased to be theoretical," Caldwell explained, dismantling their defense with surgical precision. "The state does not recognize a familial exemption for grand larceny. You committed felony fraud. You executed a premeditated theft against a dependent adult. The use of interstate electronic banking to facilitate this transfer also invites federal scrutiny. You built a textbook criminal case against yourselves." Brenda let out a sharp, ragged sob from the doorway. She abandoned her grip on the wood trim and stumbled toward the table, her hands raised in a pleading gesture. "Richard, please," she begged, her polite facade entirely shattered. We were protecting her. The hospital bills, the memory care, we thought she was losing her mind. We did this out of love to save her legacy. Caldwell looked at her with an expression devoid of pity. Love is not a recognized defense in the penal code, Brenda. Furthermore, Vivian possesses a comprehensive insurance policy that neutralizes any threat of medical debt. You fabricated a financial crisis to justify seizing her capital. And thanks to the recording device resting on this table, we have your explicit verbal confession to the premeditation of this act. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a second stack of papers, placing them beside the statutes. The situation was no longer escalating. It had reached its zenith, and the gravity of their ruin was settling over them like a weighted blanket. "I want to be exceedingly clear about your current position," Caldwell said, resting his hands on the documents. "My office has already drafted formal complaints. We have established contact with the fraud division of your banking institution. The local authorities have been notified that a substantial theft has occurred, and they are awaiting my signal to process the warrants." David slumped back in his chair. The defensive posture collapsed. He stared at the legal documents, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He was calculating his odds and realizing he held zero leverage. Caldwell leaned forward, delivering the final inescapable ultimatum. "You have one option to avoid immediate arrest," he stated, his voice resonating with unyielding authority. "By 9 o'clock on Monday morning, every single penny of the $220,000 must be wired back into Vivian Primary Trust account. Not a fraction. Not a portion minus your fabricated management fees. The entire sum. If the auction house charged you expedited seller fees or processing penalties, you will liquidate your own personal assets to cover the difference." He tapped the final set of papers. "Furthermore, to secure this leniency, you will both sign these documents tonight. The first is an irrevocable waiver forfeiting any and all current or future claims to Vivian Estate. You are permanently excised from her will. The second is a legally binding no-contact order. You will never approach her residence, her medical providers, or her person ever again." Caldwell straightened his posture, allowing the terms to saturate the room. "If the funds are not fully restored by Monday morning, or if you refuse to sign these waivers right now, I will file the criminal complaints before noon. You will be arrested at your respective workplaces. You will face public felony trials. In a town this size, the local media coverage alone will ensure you never hold a position of trust or attend a social function in this county for the rest of your natural lives." The trap had snapped shut. The design was flawless. Caldwell had weaponized the very culture Brenda cherished to ensure her compliance. The threat of a state prison sentence terrified them, but the promise of total social annihilation in their tight-knit community broke them. Brenda sank into an empty dining chair, burying her face in her hands, weeping openly as the reality of her social exile set in. Her church committees, her polite dominance, her curated legacy, all of it was incinerated. David remained silent. He stared at the printed statutes, his mind spinning through the wreckage of his schemes. He realized that returning the full sum meant he would have to drain his own dwindling accounts to cover the auction fees they could not recover. He would likely lose his dealership position when his credit collapsed on Monday. He was facing total financial and professional ruin. Slowly, David lifted his head. His eyes moved past the legal documents, past the silver recorder, and past Vivian, who sat watching the destruction with quiet satisfaction. His gaze landed on me. He stared at my face, searching for the exhausted, compliant niece he thought he had been dealing with all week. Instead, he saw the clinical detachment I had maintained since the moment I looked inside the empty floor safe. He connected the data points. He realized Brenda did not accidentally confess to an empty room. He understood who had blocked his path in the intensive care unit. He saw the architect of the trap. David looked at me, a profound, chilling recognition dawning in his dilated pupils. He knew I had built the gallows, measured the rope, and waited patiently for them to step onto the platform. I did not offer a polite smile. I did not break eye contact. I looked at the man who had tried to rob my grandmother on her deathbed, and I offered a single slow nod. My expression remained as steady cold and final as a cardiac flatline. At exactly 8:45 on Monday morning, my clinic pager buzzed, followed immediately by a secure text message from Richard Caldwell. The transmission was brief and factual. The funds have cleared the primary trust ledger in full. The legal mechanism had functioned perfectly. To meet that uncompromising deadline, David and Brenda were forced into a rapid, brutal financial triage. The Chicago auction house had retained their standard seller commission and deducted exorbitant emergency processing fees from the gross total. Because Caldwell demanded the restoration of the entire $220,000, not just the net payout my mother and uncle had to cannibalize their own hidden reserves to cover the deficit, they liquidated retirement accounts, emptied their emergency savings, and likely absorbed steep early withdrawal penalties. I read Caldwell confirmation message while standing in the sterile hallway of the orthopedic wing, noting the exact time of their compliance. The threat of a state penitentiary remains a highly effective motivator. In the medical profession, a clinical autopsy serves to reveal the precise mechanism of a systemic failure. In the enclosed ecosystem of our Iowa towns, social autopsies are conducted while the subjects are still walking the streets. Caldwell fulfilled his end of the bargain by pausing the criminal fraud complaint. However, a seasoned estate attorney understands that legal exoneration does not demand a vow of secrecy. The machinery of our community relies on discreet, polite information, sharing among its foundational pillars. When the compliance officers at the local banking branch processed an erratic emergency weekend wire transfer that drained David accounts and triggered a fraud alert, questions inevitably arose. Caldwell answered those inquiries with careful, measured honesty, citing his fiduciary duty to protect his elderly client from predatory exploitation. The truth spread through the town like a contrast dye injected into a vascular system. It traced the exact pathways of Brenda's initial smear campaign, moving relentlessly through the bank tellers, the country club board members, and the senior deacons at the Presbyterian Church. The Midwest does not punish betrayal with public shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. We punish it with a sudden, suffocating drop in ambient temperature. We weaponize etiquette. Brenda experienced this cultural frostbite firsthand on a Wednesday evening. She attempted to attend the monthly parish outreach planning meeting, operating under the staggering delusion that replacing the stolen money had magically reset her social standing. For decades, she had governed that specific room. She dictated the winter coat drives and wielded her strategic pity as an instrument of control. When she walked into the church fellowship hall that night, the conversation did not stop. Instead, the tone shifted into a hyper-polite, frictionless register. The women who used to hang on her every word suddenly found themselves deeply fascinated by their meeting agendas. The committee chairwoman, a younger woman Brenda had personally mentored, offered a tight, formal smile and informed her that the leadership roster had already been finalized for the season. They gently suggested Brenda take an indefinite sabbatical to focus on her own pressing family matters, citing the very stress Brenda had previously claimed I was suffering from. The smear campaign inverted with brutal efficiency. They used her own fabricated narrative to surgically excise her from the social hierarchy. My mother became a ghost in her own hometown. I observed her behavioral adaptations from a clinical distance. Brenda altered her daily routines to minimize the risk of chance encounters with her former peers. She stopped visiting the local grocery store during the busy post-church Sunday rush, a time she used to treat as a weekly networking event. Instead, I saw her car parked in the lot on a Tuesday morning just after dawn, when the aisles were mostly empty. She no longer lingered at the pharmacy counter to exchange gossip. She moved through the community with her head down, stripped of her pastel cardigans and her borrowed moral authority. The silence she had aimed at me was now deafening, echoing back at her from every direction. She was experiencing the terminal stages of social necrosis. David's unraveling was far more visible and structural. His polished facade rested entirely on borrowed capital and the fragile illusion of perpetual success. Draining his reserves to meet the Monday deadline triggered a catastrophic chain reaction of financial defaults. His credit score, already a precarious construct, collapsed within days. In the automotive sales industry, a regional manager must maintain pristine financial standing to secure dealership licensing and underwrite heavy inventory loans. When the corporate ownership group learned of his sudden, unexplained liquidity crisis, compounded by the quiet rumors of elder fraud circulating among the local bank executives, they moved swiftly. They terminated his employment contract by the end of the week. His firing was swift, but the true public reckoning arrived shortly after. I was driving back to the orthopedic clinic after my lunch break when I stopped at a red light near the edge of town. I looked to my right and watched a flatbed tow truck back into the driveway of David's rented townhouse. Two men in high-visibility vests secured heavy chains to the axles of the luxury SUV he had paraded around family dinners for months. David stood on his front porch in a wrinkled polo shirt, holding a ceramic mug of coffee, watching his primary symbol of status being dragged onto the steel bed of the truck. He did not yell. He did not try to argue with the repossession agents. He simply stood there absorbing the visual proof of his ruin. The traffic light turned green, and I pressed the accelerator, continuing on my route back to work. I felt no pity. I merely filed the observation away as a logical symptom of his poor choices. The poison they had carefully measured and intended to feed Vivian had ended up entirely in their own bloodstreams. They tried to steal an inheritance to elevate their own standing, assuming their victim was too weak to fight back. Instead, their greed acted as a highly effective solvent, dissolving the fragile scaffolding of their entire lives. Brenda lost her captive audience. David lost his unearned stage. They were left with nothing but the isolating reality of their own reflection, trapped in a town that knew exactly what they were. The immediate crisis was resolved, but in healthcare, a successful operation is only the first step. You must also establish a comprehensive aftercare plan to ensure the patient thrives and the infection never returns. Vivian and I still had one more critical adjustment to make to her chart. In post-acute medical care, the ultimate goal is never to return the patient to their exact prior condition. That prior condition is often what permitted the pathology to take root in the first place. The objective is to establish a new, healthy baseline. You construct a stabilized environment where the host can thrive without the risk of secondary infections. After excising the malignant presence of my mother and uncle from our daily routines, my grandmother and I focused entirely on her rehabilitation. Vivian approached her physical therapy with the same relentless drive she once used to negotiate wholesale hardware contracts. She refused to let the stroke dictate the boundaries of her remaining years. Within 2 months, her speech regained its crisp cadence and her mobility returned. But stepping back into the sprawling colonial house felt isolating. The large property required constant maintenance, and its empty hallways held too many echoes of the ambush we had survived. Vivian decided it was time to change her coordinates. She selected a premium assisted living community on the upscale western edge of our town. It was a beautiful, sprawling campus featuring manicured walking paths, a private dining room, and independent cottage suites, designed for residents who desired autonomy paired with unobtrusive medical support. The entry fees and monthly retainers for such a facility were astronomical, designed to filter out anyone without substantial liquid capital. Vivian funded the transition effortlessly. The restored $220,000 resting securely in her primary trust covered the financial requirements without making a dent in her principal investments. She moved into a sunlit corner suite, overlooking a small private lake. My Sunday routine shifted from a sense of dreaded obligation to a genuine source of comfort. I no longer had to navigate the toxic airspace of Brenda's carefully curated dining room, or endure David's boastful automotive stories. I drove to the assisted living campus every weekend, bringing fresh coffee and whatever medical journals I was currently reading. We sat on the private patio of her suite, enjoying the crisp Midwest air. We rarely spoke the names of the 2 relatives we had excised. They were effectively ghosted from our reality. Instead, we discussed inventory yields, local real estate trends, and the quiet satisfaction of watching a well-crafted plan execute itself perfectly. Our bond transitioned from a basic familial duty into an alliance built on forged steel. We had occupied a trench together. She had trusted me to coordinate her defense while she was vulnerable, and I had trusted her to deliver the final strike. That level of mutual reliance rewrites the genetic code of a relationship. I was no longer just the reliable physician assistant niece. I was her chosen lieutenant. This unspoken promotion became legally binding on a rainy Tuesday morning in late November. Vivian requested that I accompany her for a final appointment at Richard Caldwell Law Practice. We sat in the familiar oak-paneled office, the room where we had originally mapped out the destruction of Brenda Deceit. Caldwell produced a new stack of documents, the pages crisp and dense with statutory language. "This is the revised estate architecture," Caldwell stated, resting his hands on the leather folio. "Following your instructions, we have restructured the entirety of your assets." Vivian picked up a gold fountain pen. She did not hesitate. She signed the signature lines with fluid, practiced motions. Caldwell turned his attention to me, his expression reflecting profound professional respect. "Your grandmother has dissolved the previous inheritance structure." He explained, his voice maintaining its customary measured rhythm. "Brenda and David have been formally and permanently removed from all trust distributions, healthcare directives, and property deeds. Their bloodline connection has been rendered legally obsolete." He slid a separate document toward my side of the desk. "You are now named as the sole executor of the estate," Caldwell continued. "You are also the singular beneficiary. Every liquid asset, the commercial real estate holdings, and the hardware distribution dividends will transfer directly to you upon her passing. You hold the singular authority to manage her medical care and execute her final wishes." I looked at the paperwork. The magnitude of the responsibility was significant, but it did not feel heavy. It felt right. In our culture, wealth and property are traditionally passed down strict hierarchical lines, usually favoring the male heirs, regardless of their actual competence. Vivian was openly defying that convention. She was rewarding clinical loyalty and punishing emotional manipulation. She handed me the pen. I signed my name, accepting the mantle she had prepared for me. Leaving the law office, I drove us back toward the assisted living campus. Rain washed across the windshield, blurring the familiar streets of our town. I felt a profound sense of clarity, analyzing the cultural phenomenon of Iowa Nice that dictated the behavior of our neighbors. For decades, Brenda and David used polite smiles and church potlucks as a camouflage for their cruelty. They believed that maintaining a pleasant exterior granted them immunity from consequence. They assumed that as long as they framed their theft as a tragic burden, the community would nod in sympathetic agreement. But polite society is inherently fragile. It relies on everyone agreeing to ignore the cracks in the foundation. When you apply cold objective truth to that kind of facade, the paint strips away instantly. Data does not care about your social standing. Bank wires and audio recordings do not respect church committee hierarchies. By stepping outside the unspoken rules of our regional etiquette and treating their greed like a straightforward pathology, we disrupted their entire mechanism of control. We cured the disease by refusing to pretend it was just a common cold. When we arrived back at her sunlit suite, Vivian walked over to a small, heavy steel box bolted into the floor of her new walk-in closet. The Assisted Living Administration had granted her special permission to install the security device, respecting her need for private asset storage. She knelt beside it and spun the combination dial. I stood in the doorway, watching her reach into the dark interior. She did not pull out a vintage diamond bracelet or an emerald drop earring. Those artifacts were gone, liquidated by greed, and reclaimed as liquid capital. Instead, she retrieved a small, dark blue velvet box. She stood up and opened the lid. Resting on the white satin lining was a delicate sapphire necklace. It was modest compared to the sprawling vintage pieces she used to own. The stone was smaller, the chain thinner. It was an understated piece of jewelry. "I bought this yesterday." Vivian said, her gray eyes meeting mine. I looked at the deep blue stone catching the ambient light of the room. It is beautiful, I noted, recognizing the symbolic weight of the purchase. It is not a replacement, she clarified, closing the lid with a soft snap. You cannot replace history, but you can always start a new ledger. This is the first entry. She did not put the box back into the safe. She placed it on her dresser, a visible marker of a reclaimed narrative. Then she reached into the pocket of her tailored slacks and withdrew a small brass key. She stepped across the carpet and held it out to me. This is the physical override for the new floor safe, Vivian stated, her voice steady and clear. It is the only spare in existence. Keep it on your keyring. I reached out and took the brass key. The metal felt cool against my palm. Handing over the spare key to her most secure possession was the ultimate expression of her reformed care plan. It was the physical transfer of absolute trust. She was ensuring that if she ever found herself voiceless in a hospital bed again, the person holding the key would be the one who knew how to read the chart and lock the doors. I slipped the key onto my ring, letting it settle next to my house and car keys. We sat down at the small dining table in her suite, poured 2 cups of black coffee, and watched the rain fall over the private lake outside her window. The storm had passed, the infection was eradicated, and the prognosis was excellent. There was only one final entry left to record in the patient file. In the medical field, a discharge order is often misinterpreted as the conclusion of a story. Patients assume that leaving the hospital signifies the end of the disease. Practitioners know better. A discharge merely marks the transition from acute crisis management to long-term maintenance. It is the moment the patient leaves the sterile, monitored environment of the ward and steps back into the unpredictable ecosystem of their daily life. The success of a discharge does not depend on the surgery itself. It depends entirely on whether the patient is returning to a healthy habitat or walking straight back into the pathogen that sickened them in the first place. My grandmother survived her stroke. Her neurological pathways rewired themselves, her speech returned, and her motor functions stabilized. But her true survival occurred the night we excised the toxic elements from her environment. We discharged Brenda and David from our lives. We severed the emotional and financial arteries they had been quietly draining for decades. Looking back at the anatomy of this betrayal, the most striking feature is not the theft itself. Greed is a common, predictable human condition. I see it every day in my practice. What fascinates me is the sheer arrogance of their methodology. They built their entire operation on a single fatal miscalculation. They assumed the quiet daughter would remain compliant. Toxic family systems operate much like opportunistic infections. They seek out the path of least resistance. They look for the strongest, most capable member of the bloodline and gradually shift the entire load of responsibility onto their shoulders. They expect the reliable daughter to manage the care plans, administer the medications, and absorb the emotional shockwaves of every crisis. They rely on you to keep the peace at the expense of the truth. They assume that because you do not raise your voice, you lack the spine to fight back. They mistake professional composure for submission. Brenda and David looked at me and saw a convenient beast of burden. They saw a woman conditioned by the polite rules of our Midwestern culture to swallow her objections and prioritize the family image over her own instincts. They thought they could operate in the shadows because I was too busy staring at the medical monitors. They failed to realize that observing monitors teaches you how to detect the faintest irregularities in any system. When you spend your life reading vital signs, you do not miss the symptoms of a lie. Our town culture provided the perfect incubator for their deceit. The concept of Iowa Nice is a powerful anesthetic. It numbs the community to the reality of what happens behind closed doors. As long as you smile at the grocery store and bring a baked good to the charity luncheon, the community will grant you the benefit of the doubt. Brenda weaponized that courtesy. She used her church committees and her pastel cardigans as a shield, trusting that no one would dare question the motives of such a devoted, grieving daughter. She believed her reputation made her bulletproof, but a reputation built on polite fiction is inherently fragile. It cannot withstand the application of objective data. True power in these situations is never found in screaming matches. It is never found in dramatic confrontations, slammed doors, or tearful accusations. Emotional outbursts only provide your opponents with ammunition. They will use your anger to paint you as unstable, hysterical, and unreasonable. They will use your raised voice to distract the audience from their own quiet crimes. True power is found in the methodical, dispassionate collection of evidence. It is found in taking screenshots of text messages, downloading auction manifests, and charting timelines. It is found in letting them speak, letting them construct their false narratives, and letting them deposit the stolen funds into their own accounts. You do not interrupt the enemy when they are making a mistake. You simply document the error. The ultimate revenge does not require you to destroy them. It only requires you to hold up a mirror they cannot look away from. When Richard Caldwell placed those printed statutes on the dining room table and played that digital audio recording, we did not have to attack my mother or my uncle. We merely presented them with the unfiltered reflection of their own actions. We forced them to look at the undeniable proof of their greed, stripped of any polite cultural camouflage. When individuals who survive on social approval are confronted with their own undeniable depravity, the psychological collapse is swift. They cannot process the failure of their own charm. They shrink into the shadows, terrified of the very community they once sought to rule. The truth is an exceptional solvent. It dissolves the illusion and leaves only the raw facts behind. If you are listening to this right now, and you find yourself sitting in a vinyl chair in a hospital waiting room, take a deep breath. If you are the quiet one, the reliable daughter, the person expected to carry the physical burden while the rest of the family plots over the inheritance, hear my words. You are not invisible. You are in the prime position to observe everything. Do not let their loud performances intimidate you. Do not let their polite whispers gaslight you into doubting your own instincts. If the math does not add up, trust your calculations. Keep your charts updated. Secure your documentation. Maintain your perimeter with cold, clinical precision. Let them mistake your silence for weakness. Let them believe they are the smartest people in the room. You do not need to warn them that you are paying attention. You just need to wait for the precise moment when the truth will inflict the maximum amount of structural damage to their lies. Set your boundaries and defend them as if your life depends on it, because the quality of your life certainly does. You have the right to curate your own environment. You have the right to discharge toxic relatives from your daily routine, regardless of what the local community might whisper about you. Let them whisper. Their opinions are not your vital signs. Your peace of mind is the only metric that truly matters. We built a new life for Vivian, a life defined by autonomy and mutual respect. She wears her modest new sapphire necklace as a daily reminder that a legacy is not defined by the items locked in a floor safe. A legacy is defined by the resilience required to survive the people who try to take it from you. We walk through our town with our heads held high, unburdened by the secrets that crushed Brenda and David. The brass key on my keyring reminds me every single day that trust must be earned through action, not simply expected through blood relation. In the end, my mother and uncle learned a very harsh lesson about the nature of vulnerability. They saw an elderly woman on a ventilator and assumed she was a passive victim waiting to be stripped of her dignity. They underestimated the sheer tactical brilliance of a woman who built an empire from nothing. So I offer this final wry piece of advice to anyone attempting to manipulate a medical crisis for their own financial gain. Always check your patient pockets before you assume they are defenseless. You never know when they might be carrying the very instrument of your downfall. That is my diagnosis. One estate auction, one digital recorder, and a polite Midwest facade shattered by the simple application of the truth. If you have ever been the quiet one who dismantled a family scheme by simply paying attention, share your case history in the comments below. Your story might be the exact treatment protocol someone else needs to hear today. Be sure to subscribe to Fluffy Revenge for more stories of quiet women winning loud battles. We will see you in the next consultation.
The velvet boxes in the floor safe did not just hold sapphires and emeralds. They held a diagnostic mirror. When my mother and uncle orchestrated their theft while my grandmother lay tethered to a ventilator, they did not simply commit financial fraud. They exposed the fragile, hollow architecture of a specific kind of American family. We are raised in a culture that frequently prizes the appearance of unity over the presence of integrity. In the Midwest, we call it Iowa nice, but the pathology exists everywhere. It is the silent agreement to keep the peace, to pass the gravy, and to smile for the holiday photographs while ignoring the rot beneath the floorboards. Looking back on the events that dismantled my family, I realized the ordeal was not just a legal battle. It was a profound curriculum in parenting responsibility and the true nature of legacy. It forced me to examine what we actually pass down to the next generation when we prioritize reputation over reality. The first lesson lies in the inherent danger of the mask. My mother Brenda spent her life building a fortress of civic duty. She coordinated church bake sales, organized charity drives, and wrapped herself in the language of devotion. Yet when the opportunity arose to seize a large inheritance, that moral veneer evaporated. It is a cautionary tale for anyone raising children today. When parents emphasize public perception over private conscience, they raise hollow adults. Children do not learn morality from empty lectures or performative charity. They learn by watching what their parents do when they believe no one is looking. If we teach the next generation that maintaining face is more important than maintaining a soul, we equip them with the very tools of their own destruction. Greed blinded my family to their fundamental duties, proving that when wealth and status become the ultimate idols, the resulting harvest is always bitter. It is the simple, inescapable physics of cause and effect. You cannot plant seeds of deceit and expect to reap a sanctuary. The antidote to this chaos is not found in matching the volume of the aggressor. It is found in the power of stillness. When I discovered the empty safe, and later when Vivian and I sat at that staged dinner, the instinct to rage was present. Society conditions us to believe that conflict requires a shouting match, that strength is measured by how loudly we can demand justice. But true wisdom operates differently. By keeping our minds still, Vivian and I found clarity. We observed the reality of the situation without letting anger cloud our diagnostic process. This is perhaps the most vital guidance we can offer children navigating a loud, reactive world. Clarity is born from calm. When the mind remains unbothered, you possess the capacity to make precise, effective decisions. We did not need to hurl insults or orchestrate a vengeance. We simply gathered the facts and brought the truth into the light. Light does not need to fight the dark. Its mere presence dissolves the shadows. Maintaining that light requires a specific type of courage, the willingness to establish unbreakable boundaries. Traditional family structures often demand blind loyalty, suggesting that we must tolerate unacceptable behavior simply because we share a bloodline. Tolerating deceit is not an act of love, it is an act of cowardice. True emotional awareness requires the strength to sever toxic ties to preserve your own integrity. Vivian did not sink into the despair of a betrayed elder. She stood firm, drew a line in the sand, and rebuilt her life on her own terms. For parents, this translates into conscious, awakened love. Loving a child or a family member does not mean shielding them from the consequences of their actions. Often the most profound act of care is stepping aside and allowing them to bear the weight of their choices. It strips away their excuses and forces a reckoning that might eventually lead to genuine growth. Ultimately, we must redefine what constitutes a legacy in American culture. We spend our lives accumulating assets, polishing our reputations, and drafting estate plans, hoping to leave a safety net for our descendants. But the most enduring inheritance is never monetary. It is the foundation of genuine kindness, the clarity of a quiet mind, and the courage to endure adversity without sacrificing your character. My grandmother's truest legacy was not her vintage jewelry collection or her hardware distribution dividends. It was the blueprint she gave me for surviving betrayal with my dignity intact. She demonstrated that true power lies in walking away from a toxic table on your own 2 feet, carrying nothing but the truth. If you have ever found yourself sitting at a table with people who prioritize the facade over the truth, you are not alone. You have the power to stop playing your assigned role and rewrite the chart. Leave a comment below with your own experiences of drawing a line in the sand, and be sure to follow Fluffy Revenge for more stories of quiet women rewriting the rules of the game. We walk away from the wreckage, not with bitterness, but with the quiet clarity of someone who has finally seen the actors without their masks. It leaves a lingering question in the air. The next time you sit down for a family dinner and the conversation turns bright and seamless, you are forced to wonder who is holding the script and what exactly is hidden in the dark.